December 23, 1944. A prisoner of war camp outside Billings, Montana. 47 German women stood in the mess hall, staring at plates that made no sense. Golden pastry crusts glistened under fluorescent lights, steam rising from flaky surfaces that had been carefully crimped at the edges. The aroma filled the room with such richness that several of the women felt their eyes water. Beneath those crusts, they could see chunks of tender chicken, carrots, peas, and potatoes swimming in thick, creamy gravy. Each woman had been given a full individual pie, accompanied by fresh bread, real butter, and what appeared to be apple cobbler for dessert. Frida Keller, 24 years old and thin, from years of wartime rations, stood frozen with her fork halfway to her mouth. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked around at her fellow prisoners, seeing the same confusion and disbelief reflected in their faces. They had been preparing themselves emotionally for Christmas, expecting perhaps a small improvement in their daily rations. This was beyond anything they had imagined. Krista Newman leaned close to Frida and whispered in German, "Is this the Christmas feast? It must be. Nothing else makes sense." Her voice carried the weight of someone trying to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she had been taught about America. They had been told that Americans were on the brink of starvation, that their economy was collapsing under the weight of war. Yet here was food that looked like something from a pre-war feast in Germany, from the days before rationing, before ersatz coffee and bread stretched with sawdust. Waltraud Becker, whom everyone called Trudy, had worked in supply logistics for the Wehrmacht. She understood numbers, quantities, resource allocation. Her eyes moved from plate to plate, calculating. The amount of butter alone on these tables would have fed a German platoon for a week. The chicken, the vegetables, the flour for these crusts. It represented abundance that shouldn't exist in a country supposedly losing the war. Sergeant Vernon Hutchins, a lanky farm boy from outside Billings with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes, noticed the women's hesitation. He approached Frida, who had become something of an unofficial spokesperson for the group due to her improving English skills. "Everything all right, ma'am?" he asked, his Montana drawl soft and genuinely concerned. "Food's getting cold." Frida gathered her courage and formed the question in careful English. "Sergeant Hutchins, is this the Christmas meal, the special feast?" She gestured at the golden pies, her voice carrying hope that this extravagance was an exception, a once-yearly celebration that would make sense of what they were seeing. Hutchins looked genuinely confused for a moment, then smiled. "No, ma'am. Christmas dinner's in 2 days. This is just Wednesday supper. It's chicken pot pie." He said it so casually as if individual meat. Pies for prisoners were the most ordinary thing in the world. "We have it maybe once a week or so. Cook does a real nice job with the crust." He walked away, completely unaware that his simple answer had just shattered everything these women thought they knew about the war, about America, and about which side was truly winning. June 14, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the French countryside, carrying its cargo of defeated enemies toward an uncertain future. Frida Keller sat with her back pressed against the metal wall of the truck, her wrists chafed from the rope that had bound them during the first days of capture. She was 24 years old, though she felt decades older. Her radio operator's uniform, once gray and crisp, now hung loose on her frame, stained with mud from the hasty retreat through Belgium. She had been captured near the German border as Allied forces pushed eastward, her communications unit overrun before they could evacuate their equipment. Beside her sat Krista Newman, 22, whose nurse's training had made her valuable enough to be kept close to the front lines. Her hands, which had set bones and stitched wounds for German soldiers, now lay still in her lap. She had a persistent cough that worried Frida, a wet rattling sound that had started during their week in the holding facility in France. Across from them, Waltraud Becker, Trudy to those who knew her well, sat with her characteristic upright posture despite their circumstances. At 26, she was the oldest of their small group, a former administrative clerk from Dresden who had managed supply requisitions for a Wehrmacht logistics unit. Even in defeat, she maintained a composed dignity, her dark blonde hair pulled back severely, her gray eyes taking in every detail of their journey. The truck carried 47 women in total, all that remained of various auxiliary units that had been swept up in the Allied advance. Some had been radio operators like Frida, others were nurses, clerks, telephone operators, cooks, women who had believed they were serving their country's defense from safe positions behind the lines. The front lines had moved faster than anyone anticipated. Through gaps in the truck's canvas covering, Frida caught glimpses of the French landscape sliding past. Villages with damaged buildings, roads crowded with military vehicles, civilians who watched their passage with expressions ranging from relief to hatred. She understood. To these French citizens, she and her companions represented occupation, oppression, years of fear. They had been told they were being transported to England first, then across the Atlantic to America. The announcement had been met with shock. America seemed impossibly far away, another world entirely. Frida had studied some English in school, enough to read simple texts, but she had never imagined she would see the country itself. In Germany, they had been told that America was weak, divided, on the verge of economic collapse. They had been assured that American soldiers were soft, unprepared for real warfare, yet here she was, a prisoner in American hands, being transported across an ocean to a fate she couldn't predict. As the truck bounced over rough roads, Frida touched the small space in her jacket where she had hidden a photograph of her family, her mother, her sister Elsa, her younger brother Carl, who was somewhere on the Eastern Front. She wondered if she would ever see them again, or if this journey to America meant the end of everything she had once called home. The Montana landscape struck Frida as impossibly vast and empty when they finally arrived at the camp in late June. After weeks aboard cramped transport ships and trains, the women stepped off military trucks into a world of enormous sky and distant mountains. The prisoner of war facility sat in rolling plains outside Billings, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, but beyond those barriers stretched nothing but grassland, extending to horizons that seemed to have no end. Frida, who had grown up in Berlin's dense urban neighborhoods, felt disoriented by so much open space. The camp itself was modest, a collection of wooden barracks, a mess hall, administrative buildings, and a small medical facility. It was designed to house perhaps 60 prisoners, which made it tiny compared to the massive male POW camps they had heard about in Texas and other states. This was a specialized facility, one of only a handful designated for female prisoners of war. The American military apparently hadn't anticipated capturing many German women. Sergeant Vernon Hutchins was among the first Americans the women met upon arrival. He was perhaps 25 years old, tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who had spent his life working outdoors. His uniform was crisp, his manner professional, but there was something in his face that confused Frida. He looked uncomfortable, almost apologetic, as if he wasn't quite sure how to treat female prisoners. Lieutenant Helen Carmichael represented a different kind of surprise. She was one of only 3 female officers assigned to the facility. A woman, perhaps 30 years old, with auburn hair, pulled back in a regulation bun, and sharp green eyes that seemed to catalog everything. She stood ramrod straight as she addressed the assembled prisoners through a translator, explaining camp rules, daily schedules, and expectations. Her voice carried authority, but Frida detected something else beneath the official tone, perhaps curiosity, perhaps sympathy. The women were processed systematically. Their few remaining personal belongings were cataloged. They were issued plain gray prison uniforms that replaced their tattered military clothes. They were assigned to barracks, 6 women to a room, with metal frame beds and thin mattresses. Frida found herself sharing quarters with Krista and Trudy, along with 3 other women: Anna, a former telephone operator from Hamburg, Margaret, a cook who had served field kitchens, and Sophie, a quiet girl of 19 who had been a clerk. That first night, lying on an unfamiliar bed in an enemy country, thousands of miles from home, Frida stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile her expectations with reality. The Americans had not been cruel. They had been efficient, professional, almost businesslike in their treatment. Sergeant Hutchins had even helped Krista with her bag when he noticed she was struggling with her cough. Such small courtesies seemed at odds with the monsters she had been taught to expect. Through the thin walls, Frida could hear other women crying softly, trying to muffle their sobs in their pillows. She understood. They were all trying to process the same impossible reality. They were prisoners of war in America, facing an unknown future in a country they had been taught to hate and fear, yet finding that the faces of their enemies looked far more human than propaganda had ever suggested. The first full day in the camp began at 6 in the morning with a bell that echoed across the compound. Frida woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was, until she saw the unfamiliar barrack ceiling and heard the sounds of other women stirring in their bunks. Krista's cough punctuated the morning quiet. Trudy was already up, making her bed with military precision, her face composed despite having slept in enemy captivity. They dressed in their issued gray uniforms and filed out of the barracks with the other prisoners, joining the line forming outside the mess hall. The morning air carried a chill despite the summer season, and Frida wrapped her arms around herself, feeling how thin she had become. Her uniform hung loose at the waist, evidence of months of inadequate rations in Germany before her capture. Inside the mess hall, they received their first American breakfast as prisoners. Frida moved through the service line, watching as camp personnel placed food on her metal tray. Oatmeal, thick and steaming, 2 slices of toast, a small portion of scrambled eggs, real eggs, not the powdered substitute she had grown accustomed to in Germany, a cup of coffee that actually smelled like coffee, not the roasted grain mixture that had replaced real coffee beans years ago. She sat with Krista and Trudy at one of the long tables, the 3 of them instinctively staying close together in this foreign environment. Around them, other German women sat in small clusters, speaking in hushed voices, their eyes darting nervously toward the American guards who stood at intervals around the room. Frida picked up her fork and took a bite of the eggs. They were real. Actual eggs with butter, seasoned with salt and pepper. The taste was so familiar, yet so distant from her recent experience, that she felt tears prick at her eyes. In Germany, eggs had become a luxury reserved for special rations. Her family had not seen fresh eggs in months. Yet here in an American prison camp, eggs appeared on breakfast trays as if they were ordinary, unremarkable. Krista ate slowly, still fighting her cough, but Frida noticed how her friend's eyes widened at the taste of real coffee. Trudy ate methodically, her gaze sweeping across the mess hall, taking in details. The amount of food being served, the portions that seemed generous by wartime standards, the food that remained after everyone had been served, food that would apparently be thrown away rather than saved. None of the women spoke about what they were noticing, not yet. It was too soon, too dangerous to voice thoughts that contradicted everything they had been told. They had been assured that America was suffering under blockades, that their agricultural system was collapsing, that American civilians were starving while their government poured resources into a war they couldn't win. Yet here was breakfast with real eggs, real coffee, fresh bread with actual butter available on the table. Sergeant Hutchins stood near the serving line, his posture relaxed, his face showing neither hostility nor excessive friendliness. Frida noticed that he seemed well-fed, his uniform fitting properly across broad shoulders. The other American personnel looked similarly healthy. Their faces showed no signs of the deprivation that marked every German face she had seen in the past year. 3 days into their imprisonment, Krista's cough worsened to the point where she could barely catch her breath between fits. Frida watched with growing concern as her friend struggled through breakfast, pushing food around her plate without eating, her face flushed with fever. The camp doctor had examined Krista and prescribed rest, but the barracks were drafty despite the summer heat outside, and the thin blankets provided little warmth when chills racked Krista's body at night. The illness that had started as a minor cough in France had developed into something more serious during their ocean crossing. Sergeant Hutchins had apparently been watching Krista as well. On the 4th morning, As the women filed out of the mess hall after breakfast, he approached their small group with an expression of genuine concern. Frida instinctively stepped forward, positioning herself between the American soldier and her sick friend. She had been told that American men were dangerous, but Hutchins stopped at a respectful distance, his hands clearly visible, his posture non-threatening. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Frida since her English was marginally better than the others, "your friend there? She's not doing too good, is she?" He gestured toward Krista, who was leaning against Trudy for support, her breathing labored. Frida searched for the English words. "She is sick. The doctor, he gave medicine, but she is—" She trailed off, frustrated by her limited vocabulary. Hutchins nodded, understanding despite her broken English. "She's cold, even though it's warm out. I've seen that before. My little sister used to get the same way when she was sick. Wait here a moment." He disappeared into one of the administrative buildings and returned carrying a thick wool blanket and a small basket covered with a cloth napkin. He offered both to Frida, speaking slowly. "The blanket's extra. Nobody's using it. And Cook made fresh bread this morning. My grandma always said fresh bread and butter helps when you're fighting off a chest cold." Frida stared at the items in confusion. This was not how enemies behaved. Enemies did not bring extra blankets and fresh bread. She looked at Hutchins's face, searching for signs of mockery or hidden cruelty, but found only awkward kindness, a farm boy's simple desire to help someone who was suffering. She accepted the items carefully, as if they might vanish if she moved too quickly. "Thank you," she managed in English, the words feeling strange when directed at an American soldier. Hutchins nodded and stepped back. "Make sure she eats something, and tell her to keep warm even if she feels hot." He walked away before Frida could formulate another response. Back in the barracks, Frida unwrapped the cloth napkin to reveal 2 thick slices of bread, still warm, with real butter already spread between them. The smell alone made Krista's eyes flutter open. Trudy helped prop her up while Frida broke off small pieces of bread, encouraging Krista to eat slowly. The bread was extraordinary, soft, made from real wheat flour, with butter so rich it left a golden sheen on their fingers. In Germany, such bread existed only in memories from before the war. Krista ate half a slice before exhaustion claimed her again, but Frida noticed that her breathing seemed slightly easier, her expression less pained. That evening, wrapped in the American blanket, Krista slept without the violent shivering that had marked previous nights. Frida lay in her own bunk, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile Sergeant Hutchins's simple act of kindness with everything she had been taught about the American enemy. By early October, the Montana autumn had turned the distant mountains gold and crimson, colors that reminded Frida achingly of home. The women had settled into a routine, morning formations, work assignments, meals that continued to confuse them with their abundance, and evening hours in the barracks speaking German. Krista had recovered from her illness, thanks in part to Sergeant Hutchins's bread and blanket, though she never spoke of it directly. Lieutenant Carmichael had begun offering English lessons twice a week in the camp's small recreation room. Attendance was voluntary, and at first, only a handful of women appeared, suspicious of what learning the enemy's language might mean. But Frida came to every session, driven by practical understanding that communication would make their captivity easier. Trudy joined her after the second week, her analytical mind appreciating the structure of grammar lessons. The lieutenant was a patient teacher, using a chalkboard to write simple phrases with gestures. "Good morning, good evening, thank you, please." Basic courtesies that transformed guards and prisoners from hostile strangers into people who could acknowledge each other's humanity. Frida discovered she had an aptitude for languages. The English she had learned in school began to resurface. She started forming simple sentences, asking basic questions, understanding when Americans spoke slowly. Lieutenant Carmichael seemed pleased, occasionally keeping her after lessons to practice more complex phrases. During one such session, the lieutenant asked a question that seemed casual but carried weight. "What did you do before the war, Frida?" Frida hesitated, unused to Americans treating her as a person with a past. I worked in an office, communications, telephone systems in Berlin. You must miss it. The city, I mean." Did she miss Berlin? The city had been transformed by war into something unrecognizable. Bombed buildings, food lines, constant fear. "I miss what it was," she finally said. "Before." Lieutenant Carmichael nodded. "War changes everything, doesn't it? Even the places we call home." Through these lessons, Frida began noticing things that troubled her. She noticed how Americans threw away food, bread crusts, vegetable peelings, coffee grounds, waste that would have been hoarded in Germany. She noticed how Sergeant Hutchins mentioned his family's farm produced so much wheat they didn't know what to do with surplus. She noticed how Lieutenant Carmichael spoke of rationing as an inconvenience rather than desperate measure. Most troubling, the Americans seemed genuinely confused by the German women's constant surprise at adequate food and basic comforts. To the Americans, these things were normal, unremarkable, the baseline of ordinary life, even during wartime. The cognitive dissonance grew with each passing day. If America had this much abundance to spare for prisoners, what did that suggest about the war's trajectory? What did it mean about everything they had been told regarding America's weakness and imminent collapse? Frida kept these observations to herself, but she saw the same questions forming in Trudy's calculating eyes, in the way Krista had begun watching the Americans with something approaching wonder rather than fear. The wall, they had been told, separated civilized Germans from barbaric Americans was crumbling brick by brick, meal by meal, kindness by kindness. And none of them knew what would remain when that wall finally fell completely. Late October brought the first real cold snap to Montana, and with it, a change in work assignments for several prisoners. Frida, Krista, and Trudy were reassigned to kitchen duty, helping prepare meals under the supervision of Cook Patterson, a large woman from Texas with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could carry a cross. The entire camp, she was brusque but not unkind, showing the German women how Americans expected kitchens to operate, efficiently, cleanly, and with an abundance that still shocked them. The first morning in the kitchen, Frida stood at a prep table peeling potatoes, while Cook Patterson worked on the massive industrial stove. The smells that filled the kitchen were intoxicating and heartbreaking. Roasting meat, actual beef, bread baking, the yeast and wheat aroma so pure it made Frida's eyes water. Vegetables being sautéed in real butter. Trudy, assigned to inventory duty, stood in the storage room with a clipboard, her face growing pale as she cataloged what was there. Flour in 50-pound sacks, dozens of them. Canned goods stacked floor to ceiling. Peaches, pears, green beans, tomatoes. Sugar in quantities she had not seen since before the war. Coffee, real coffee, in massive containers. The sheer volume of food available to feed fewer than 80 people seemed impossible. She emerged from the storage room and caught Frida's eye, shaking her head slightly. No words were needed. Trudy had worked in Wehrmacht supply logistics. She understood rationing, resource allocation, the mathematics of feeding an army and a nation under siege. What she had just seen represented abundance that should not exist in a country supposedly losing a war. During lunch preparation, Cook Patterson showed them how to make beef stew, American style. She browned chunks of beef in a Dutch oven, added onions and garlic, poured in beef stock, and then casually tossed in carrots, potatoes, and celery with careless abundance. "We'll serve this with cornbread," she announced. "And there's apple pie for dessert." Krista, stirring the stew as instructed, watched the chunks of beef bob in the rich broth. In Munich, before her capture, her family's weekly meat ration would have fit in her palm. This single pot contained more meat than her entire neighborhood would have seen in a month. She thought of her mother's letters, carefully worded to pass censors, containing coded messages about hunger, about neighbors collapsing from malnutrition. That afternoon, as the women peeled apples for pie, Cook Patterson chatted casually about her family, about how rationing meant they had to use margarine sometimes instead of butter. "Can't get butter as easy as we used to," she complained mildly, "but we manage." Frida exchanged glances with Trudy. Managing meant something entirely different in America than it did in Germany. Here, managing meant choosing margarine over butter occasionally. In Germany, managing meant boiling shoe leather to extract whatever nutrients might remain. As evening approached and they prepared dinner, Frida found herself overwhelmed by the smells, the abundance, the casual way Americans treated food that would have been treasured as precious luxuries in her homeland. She thought of her sister Elsa's letters describing queues for turnips, about bread that was more sawdust than grain. And here she stood in an enemy prison camp, surrounded by more food than she had seen in years, preparing meals that would have fed her entire Berlin neighborhood. The contrast was no longer something she could ignore or explain away. November arrived with the first snow, light flurries that transformed the Montana landscape into something ethereal and cold. Mail call had become a weekly ritual filled with desperate hope and crushing disappointment. The Red Cross facilitated correspondence between prisoners and their families in Germany, though letters took weeks to arrive and were heavily censored. Each week, Lieutenant Carmichael would stand in the recreation room with letters, reading names while women held their breath. Frida received her first letter in early November, nearly 5 months after her capture. She recognized her sister Elsa's handwriting immediately and retreated to her bunk to read it in private. The letter had been written in August, when Elsa had finally received notification that her sister was alive and imprisoned in America. The words were carefully chosen, written knowing censors would read every line. Else wrote about daily life in Berlin, about their mother's health, about neighbors and small domestic details. But between those innocent lines, Frida could read the truth. References to difficult shopping days meant severe food shortages. Mentions of mother's persistent cough suggested malnutrition-related illness. A casual note that the Werner family moved away suddenly likely meant they had died in bombing raids. Most telling was a single sentence: "We are managing on less than we ever thought possible, and still they tell us to sacrifice more for victory." Frida read that line 3 times. The German people were starving while being assured that victory was imminent, that their enemies were suffering equally or worse. Frida folded the letter and looked around the barracks. On her small table sat an apple she had saved from lunch, a luxury she could afford because meals came 3 times daily with reliable abundance. Through the window, she could see the camp's storage buildings, filled with supplies. And here was her sister's letter, describing a reality where an apple would have been shared among multiple family members. Krista received a letter the same week from her mother in Munich. She read it silently, her face growing distressed, then passed it to Frida without comment. The letter described conditions after recent Allied bombing raids. Krista's mother wrote about neighborhoods reduced to rubble, about water shortages, about the black market being the only source of adequate food. She wrote about a neighbor who had collapsed from hunger while standing in a ration queue. The most devastating part came at the end. "I pray daily that wherever you are, you have enough to eat. They tell us that Americans treat prisoners terribly, but I cannot imagine anything worse than what we face here. At least you are alive, my daughter." Trudy received no letter, though she came to mail call every week with diminishing hope. Dresden had been heavily bombed, and she had no way of knowing if her family still lived. That evening in the mess hall, the women ate beef stew with fresh bread, followed by canned peaches for dessert. The contrast between their letters from home and the reality of their imprisonment had become impossible to ignore. After dinner, sitting in the barracks with letters in hand, Krista finally whispered what they had all been thinking. "They lied to us about everything." The words hung in the air like smoke, unable to be taken back, impossible to unhear. The letters from home had opened a door that could not be closed, and through it rushed questions the women had been suppressing for months. It began with small conversations in the barracks after lights out, whispered in German so the guards could not understand. Frida, Krista, and Trudy lay in their bunks in the darkness, finally giving voice to thoughts that had been growing since their first American breakfast of real eggs and coffee. "If they lied about the food," Krista whispered, "what else did they lie about?" The question hung in the air like something dangerous and forbidden. To question the propaganda was to question everything they had believed about the war, about their service, about the righteousness of their cause. It meant acknowledging that they might have been deceived, not just about small details, but about fundamental truths. Trudy spoke from her bunk, her voice carrying the analytical precision she brought to everything. "I have been calculating the supplies in the kitchen storage room. The amount of food available to feed fewer than 80 people would feed an entire German battalion for weeks. And this is just one small camp in the middle of nowhere." She paused, letting the implications sink in. If America has this much abundance to spare for prisoners while fighting a war across 2 oceans, what does that tell us about their industrial capacity? About everything we were told regarding their weakness? Frida thought about Sergeant Hutchins mentioning his family's farm produced more wheat than they knew what to do with. She thought about Cook Patterson complaining that butter was sometimes hard to get, as if that represented genuine hardship. She thought about the casual way Americans threw away food that would have been precious in Germany. "They told us America was on the verge of collapse," Frida said quietly. "They told us that their people were starving, that their economy could not sustain the war effort, that victory was inevitable because we were stronger, more disciplined, more willing to sacrifice. But we are the ones who were starving," Krista finished. "We are the ones whose economy was collapsing. Everything they told us was backwards." The realization was devastating, not because it was surprising, but because speaking it aloud made it undeniably real. They had been lied to systematically, deliberately, completely about the most basic facts of the war they had been serving. Other women in the barracks had fallen silent, listening. Someone struck a match, lighting a small candle that cast flickering shadows on the walls. In that dim light, Frida could see faces marked by the same troubled realization. Anna, a former telephone operator, spoke from across the room. "I operated communications for a supply unit. The reports we processed were always marked urgent, always desperate. We were told it was because everything was being diverted to the front lines for final victory. But what if there simply was not enough? What if there was never enough?" Margaret, who had worked in field kitchens, added her observation. "I cooked for German soldiers with whatever we could find. Turnips, potatoes when we were lucky, meat so rarely I can count the times. And I was told this was temporary, that once we won, abundance would return. But America is at war too, and their prisoners eat beef stew with fresh bread." The conversations continued late into the night, women sharing observations they had been afraid to voice. With each shared realization, the wall of propaganda crumbled further. They had been fed lies along with their inadequate rations, and now, surrounded by American abundance, the truth was impossible to deny. Early December brought heavy snow and the first announcements about Christmas celebrations at the camp. Lieutenant Carmichael gathered the women in the recreation room on a cold afternoon. The camp had been decorated modestly. A small pine tree in the corner, paper garlands made by prisoners, a sense of anticipation that transcended the barbed wire. The lieutenant explained that the camp would observe Christmas with special meals and a relaxation of some restrictions. The women could prepare decorations, organize entertainment if they wished, and religious services would be arranged. The announcement was met with mixed emotions. For many of the women, Christmas had always been the most important celebration of the year. Now they would spend it as prisoners, thousands of miles from home, separated from everyone they loved. The sadness was palpable, eyes glistening with unshed tears as the lieutenant spoke. But there was also curiosity. None of them had experienced an American Christmas. They had been told that Americans were godless materialists who had corrupted the sacred holiday into a commercial spectacle. Yet Lieutenant Carmichael spoke of Christmas with genuine reverence, mentioning church services and the importance of celebrating hope, even in difficult circumstances. Frida volunteered to help coordinate decorations, partly to keep busy, and partly out of curiosity about how Americans observe the holiday. She worked alongside Sergeant Hutchins, who brought supplies from town: construction paper, scissors, string, pine branches that filled the recreation room with their sharp, clean scent. As they worked, he told her about Christmases on his family's farm, about his mother's tradition of baking dozens of cookies, about the community gathering at church. "It's hard being away from home this time of year," he said, carefully cutting paper into star shapes. "But I figure if we can make it a little nicer here, for everyone, maybe that's what the holiday is supposed to be about, taking care of folks, even when times are tough." Krista and Trudy joined the decoration effort, and soon other women did as well. They folded paper into intricate snowflakes, a craft many had learned as children. They wove pine branches into wreaths. Someone suggested teaching the Americans a German Christmas carol, and the idea spread quickly. They would sing O Tannenbaum and Stille Nacht, Silent Night, the carol that transcended nationality. As December progressed, the mood in the camp shifted subtly. The women were still prisoners, still facing an uncertain future, still separated from their families. But the preparation for Christmas created a sense of shared purpose with their captors. Americans and Germans worked side by side to hang decorations, to practice carols, to create something beautiful in a place designed for confinement. Cook Patterson announced that Christmas dinner would be something special, though she refused to give details. The women speculated endlessly about what this might mean. They had already been shocked by regular meals. What would Americans consider special enough for Christmas? Their expectations were modest, shaped by years of deprivation, perhaps extra portions of the usual fare, perhaps a small piece of chocolate or an orange. They had no concept of what was actually being planned. They could not imagine that in less than 3 weeks, they would sit down to a feast that would fundamentally alter their understanding of everything they thought they knew about scarcity, abundance, and which side was truly winning the war. December 23rd arrived cold and clear, the Montana sky a brilliant blue above snow-covered plains. The day began like any other: morning formation, work assignments, the familiar routine that had become almost comfortable over 6 months of imprisonment. Frida worked in the kitchen, helping Cook Patterson with preparations, though the large woman remained mysteriously secretive about what exactly they were preparing for. The kitchen smelled extraordinary, rich and savory in ways that made Frida's mouth water. At noon, Lieutenant Carmichael announced that lunch would be served early and that all prisoners should report to the mess hall. The women filed in, curious about the deviation from routine, and stopped in collective astonishment at what they saw. The tables had been set with care, real plates instead of metal trays, cloth napkins, even small sprigs of pine as centerpieces, and at each place setting sat something that looked like it had emerged from a dream or a memory of peacetime abundance. Individual pies, golden-crusted and steaming, each one perhaps 8 inches across. The crusts had been crimped decoratively, and small vents in the top released fragrant steam that carried scents of chicken, vegetables, and rich gravy. Frida stood frozen, unable to process what she was seeing. Beside each pie sat a generous slice of fresh bread, a pat of butter, and a small bowl of green beans. At the end of each table were pitchers of milk and apple cider. It was a feast, the kind of meal she associated with Christmas celebrations from before the war, when Germany had been prosperous and food had been abundant. The women sat slowly, reverently, as if moving too quickly might shatter the illusion. Krista's hands trembled as she picked up her fork. Trudy stared at her plate with the calculating expression she wore when processing information that did not fit expected parameters. Around the room, 47 German women sat in stunned silence, unable to believe what they had been given. Sergeant Hutchins moved through the room, ensuring everyone had been served, his expression pleased but not understanding the depth of the prisoner's reaction. He paused near Frida's table, noticing that none of the women had yet begun eating. Frida looked up at him, searching for words in her still imperfect English. Finally, she managed to ask, "Sergeant Hutchins, is this the Christmas meal? The special feast?" Hutchins looked genuinely confused for a moment, glancing at the pies as if trying to understand why she was asking. Then he smiled, that easy farm boy smile that had become familiar over the months. "No, ma'am," he said, his tone casual and matter-of-fact. "Christmas dinner's in 2 days. This is just Wednesday supper. It's chicken pot pie. Cook makes it maybe once a week or so. She does a real nice job with the crust, don't she?" He walked away, completely unaware that his simple answer had just shattered the final pillars of everything these women had believed about America's weakness and Germany's strength. Frida sat motionless, fork still in hand, trying to process what she had just heard. This feast, this abundance of tender meat and vegetables and flaky pastry, this meal that would have been celebrated as a Christmas miracle in Germany, this was ordinary Wednesday dinner, regular food, something Americans ate once a week without thinking twice. Around her, she heard other women beginning to understand, voices whispering in shocked German, the reality of their situation finally, completely, undeniably clear. The women sat in stunned silence, staring at the golden-crusted pies before them, trying to process Sergeant Hutchins's casual revelation. Just Wednesday dinner, regular food. Something served once a week without ceremony or celebration. Frida's fork trembled in her hand as the full weight of understanding crashed over her. For 6 months, she had been constructing explanations for the abundance she witnessed. Perhaps this camp was special. Perhaps these rations were temporary. Perhaps the Americans were trying to impress Red Cross inspectors. Every rationalization had been an attempt to preserve some fragment of what she had been taught about American weakness. But there was no explaining away chicken pot pie as regular Wednesday dinner. This was not propaganda or theater. This was simply how Americans ate, even during wartime, even when feeding enemy prisoners. Krista cut into her pie with shaking hands, releasing steam that carried the rich scent of chicken and vegetables. The filling was thick with meat, carrots, peas, potatoes, all swimming in creamy gravy. She took a small bite and closed her eyes, and Frida saw tears slip down her friend's cheeks. It tasted like every Christmas dinner Krista remembered from before the war. Trudy ate methodically, but her face had taken on the expression of someone recalculating everything they thought they understood about the world. She had managed logistics, had processed supply reports, had seen the numbers that supposedly proved Germany's industrial might and America's weakness. But numbers could be manipulated, reports could be falsified. This pie was a truth that could not be denied. Around the mess hall, other women were having similar revelations. Voices rose in German, some angry, some confused, some simply devastated. Anna pushed her plate away, unable to eat, while processing what this abundance meant. Margaret stared at her pie as if it were evidence in a trial. Sergeant Hutchins, noticing the distress spreading through the room, approached Lieutenant Carmichael with concern. Frida watched them confer in low voices, saw the lieutenant's expression shift from confusion to comprehension. She moved through the room speaking quietly to clusters of women. Frida forced herself to eat, to taste this meal that had shattered her worldview. The crust was flaky and buttery, the filling rich and satisfying. It was extraordinary food, the kind that should have been reserved for celebrations. And Americans served it to prisoners on a random Wednesday in December, so casually that the guards seemed genuinely puzzled by the prisoners' response. By the time the meal ended, every woman in that room understood something that could never be unlearned. They had been lied to, systematically and completely, about the most fundamental facts of the war. Christmas morning arrived with fresh snow and church bells ringing from the small chapel the camp shared with the nearby town. The women had been given the option to attend services, and most chose to go. Frida sat in the wooden pew, listening to hymns sung in English, finding comfort in melodies that transcended language. Silent Night sounded the same, whether sung as Stille Nacht or in English, And when the congregation reached that familiar carol, German voices joined American ones. After services, the women returned to camp to find the mess hall transformed. Red and green decorations hung from the ceiling. The tables had been covered with white cloths. Small sprigs of pine served as centerpieces, and someone had strung lights that cast a warm glow. But it was the smell that stopped Frida in her tracks. Roasting turkey, baking bread, cinnamon, and nutmeg from pies. The aromas were so rich, so abundant, that several women simply stood in the doorway, unable to process what their senses were telling them. Cook Patterson emerged from the kitchen, her face flushed. "Merry Christmas, ladies," she called out. "Hope you brought your appetites." The women were seated, and then the food began arriving. Roasted turkey, golden brown and glistening, baked ham with glaze, mashed potatoes whipped with butter and cream, gravy that steamed with savory richness, green beans with almonds, candied yams, fresh rolls so soft they seemed to melt, cranberry sauce, corn pudding, sweet potato casserole. Frida stared at her plate, unable to comprehend the amount of food before her. This was not just abundance, this was extravagance, the kind of feast she associated with wealthy families in peacetime, not with prison camps during war. Beside her, Krista had begun crying again. "I'm sorry," Krista managed to say to Lieutenant Carmichael, who had approached with concern. "My mother wrote that they had nothing for Christmas, turnip soup if they were lucky, and here I am, a prisoner, eating better than I ever did at home. How is that possible?" The lieutenant's face showed sympathy. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize. This is how we do Christmas, even here. It's about sharing what we have." The meal continued, though many women struggled to eat through their emotions. Dessert arrived, 3 kinds of pie, apple, pumpkin, and pecan, plus cookies, plus coffee with real cream and sugar. It was more food than Frida had seen in one place since before the war began. Sergeant Hutchins stopped by their table. "I know this must be hard," he said, "being away from home, especially today. But everyone deserves a good Christmas, even if we're on different sides." As evening fell, Frida sat by the window, watching snow fall on Montana plains. She thought about her family in Berlin, about what they might have eaten today, about the contrast between their Christmas and hers. The guilt was overwhelming. The day after Christmas, the barracks were quieter than usual, the women processing emotions too complex for conversation. Frida sat at the small table by her bunk, pen in hand, staring at blank paper. She wanted to write to Elsa to somehow explain what she was experiencing, but the words seemed impossible. How could she describe yesterday's feast to her sister, who was subsisting on turnip soup? She began writing anyway, knowing the letter would never be sent. The censors would never allow such honest description of American abundance. But she needed to write it. "Dear Elsa," she wrote in German. "Yesterday was Christmas, and I ate a meal that would have fed our entire apartment building. Turkey, ham, potatoes with real butter, vegetables I haven't seen in years, 3 kinds of pie. I am a prisoner, Elsa, and I ate like royalty while you stand in queues hoping for bread. They told us Americans were weak, starving, barely holding on. They lied. Everything we were told was a lie. America has so much abundance, they serve meat pies to prisoners and call it ordinary dinner. I don't know who I am anymore. I only know that the Germany we thought we were serving never existed." Across the room, Krista was writing her own unsendable letter. "Everything you were told about my captivity is false," she wrote to her mother. "They don't torture us. They feed us better than our own army fed us. They treat us with more dignity than I saw some Germans treat each other. I was taught that Americans were cruel, godless, barbaric. But Sergeant Hutchins reminds me of Papa. Lieutenant Carmichael could be my school teacher. They're just people, Mama. We were told we were fighting for civilization against barbarians, but I think we had it backwards." Trudy's letter was more analytical, addressed to no one in particular. She calculated the resources required to produce Christmas dinner, estimated the industrial capacity necessary to generate such abundance during wartime, and compared it to the desperate supply reports she had processed. The numbers told a story of overwhelming American superiority that had been hidden behind propaganda's lies. Later that evening, the three friends gathered in the corner of the barracks, their unsendable letters spread before them. "We can't tell them the truth," Frida said quietly. "The censors would never allow it. Our families will continue believing the lies until the war ends." "And when the war ends," Krista added, "and they finally learn the truth, what will they think of us?" Trudy folded her letter carefully. "Perhaps they'll understand that we were all victims of the same deception." The women sat in silence, holding letters that spoke truths too dangerous to send. January 1945 brought bitter cold and a shift in the atmosphere of the camp that had nothing to do with weather. The chicken pot pie revelation had destroyed the final barriers between captors and captives. The women no longer maintained the rigid military bearing they had clung to in the early months. Guards no longer treated them with the formal distance appropriate for enemy prisoners. Something fundamental had changed, and everyone in the camp felt it. Frida's English had improved dramatically, and she now served as an unofficial translator for many of the women. Lieutenant Carmichael had begun keeping her after lessons, not just to practice language, but to have actual conversations about books, about life before the war, about hopes for what might come after. These discussions revealed a world Frida had never imagined, an America that bore no resemblance to the propaganda caricature she had been taught. One afternoon, Sergeant Hutchins invited Frida, Krista, and Trudy to join him in the recreation room where he was repairing a radio. As he worked, he talked about his family's farm outside Billings, about the wheat fields that stretched for miles, about harvest seasons when they produced more grain than they could sell. "We had to leave some of it in the fields last year," he said. "Too much to harvest, not enough workers with so many men overseas. Can you imagine? Leaving food in the fields because we had too much?" Trudy, who had managed Wehrmacht supply chains, could not imagine it. In Germany, every grain had been counted, hoarded, rationed down to the last kernel. The idea of abundance so great that food was left unharvested seemed like something from a fairy tale. "How is this possible?" she asked in halting English. "How does America have so much?" Hutchins shrugged, not understanding the depth of her confusion. "Big country, good farmland, lots of rain. We've always had plenty, I guess. Even with rationing, we're doing all right." The casual way he spoke about abundance, as if it were the natural order of things, struck all three women silent. This was not temporary wartime luck. This was simply America, a country so vast, so rich in resources that even its prisoners ate better than German soldiers had. Krista asked a question that had been haunting her since Christmas. "Sergeant Hutchins, if America has all this, the food, the resources, why did Germany think we could win the war?" Hutchins looked uncomfortable, not wanting to say something that might hurt them, but Frida pressed. "Please, we need to understand," he sighed. "From what I've heard, your leaders knew they couldn't win a long war. They were counting on quick victories, on other countries surrendering before America could fully mobilize. But once we got our factories running, once we started producing at full capacity..." He trailed off. "We never had a chance," Trudy finished quietly. "Not once America entered the war. All those sacrifices, all for nothing, because our leaders lied about what we were facing." The winter conversations continued like this, each discussion peeling back another layer of propaganda, revealing truths that were both liberating and devastating. The women learned about American industrial capacity, about the thousands of ships being built, about assembly lines producing bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. They learned that while they had been told America was on the verge of collapse, the opposite had been true. Germany was the country running out of everything, while America was just beginning to flex its economic might. February brought news that everyone had known was coming, but had hoped somehow to avoid. The Allied advance into Germany had accelerated. Cities were falling, territory shrinking, and the end was clearly approaching. But with the military news came something else, something that made the food revelation seem trivial by comparison. Reports began filtering through about what Allied forces were discovering as they liberated concentration camps. Lieutenant Carmichael called a meeting in the recreation room one evening, her face grave. Through a translator, she explained that she wanted the women to hear the news from her rather than through rumors. What she described seemed impossible, too horrific to be real. Places like Auschwitz, where systematic murder had been carried out on an industrial scale. Where people, Jews, political prisoners, Roma, disabled individuals, had been exterminated like vermin, the room erupted in shock and denial. "This is propaganda," Anna shouted in German. "Allied lies to make us look like monsters." But Lieutenant Carmichael was prepared. She had photographs, grainy and terrible, images that could not be faked or dismissed. She had testimony from soldiers who had liberated the camps, descriptions so detailed and consistent they could not be coordinated lies. She had documents, Nazi documents, proving that these atrocities had been official policy. Frida stared at a photograph of skeletal prisoners behind barbed wire, their eyes hollow, their bodies barely alive. She felt the room spinning around her. This could not be real. This could not be what Germany had done. But the evidence was undeniable, overwhelming, damning. Krista ran from the room and could be heard vomiting outside. Trudy sat frozen, her face drained of all color. Around them, women were crying, denying, trying desperately to reject what they were seeing. But they had already learned one terrible lesson about the lies they had been told. They had already discovered that propaganda could invert reality so completely that prisoners ate better than citizens. If the lies could run that deep about something as basic as food, why not about this too? "We didn't know," someone whispered in German. "We didn't know this was happening." "No," Frida said, her voice hollow. "We didn't know. But that doesn't mean we're not responsible. We served the people who did this. We believed in the cause that made this possible. We didn't ask enough questions. We didn't demand to see the truth." The women who had their worldview shattered by chicken pot pie now faced a darker truth. They had not just been on the wrong side of the war, they had been on the side of evil. And all the kindness shown to them by their American captors, all the abundance they had been given, was more than they deserved. Much more than the victims of their country's crimes had ever received. April 1945 brought the news everyone had been expecting but still dreaded. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had collapsed. In cities across America, people celebrated in the streets, but in the Montana prison camp, the atmosphere was somber. For the German women prisoners, victory for the Allies meant defeat for everything they had once believed in. Lieutenant Carmichael gathered the women in the recreation room to discuss what would happen next. Through careful translation, she explained that arrangements were being made for repatriation. Within months, they would be transported back to Germany to face whatever remained of their homeland. The announcement was met with silence. No one cheered. No one expressed relief at going home. Home no longer existed as they had known it. Letters from families had painted a picture of devastation, cities in ruins, families scattered or dead, a country that would take generations to rebuild. And now they knew the full truth about what Germany had done. Frida raised her hand, and Lieutenant Carmichael nodded for her to speak. "What if some of us do not wish to return immediately?" The question hung in the air like something dangerous. Around the room, other women looked up with sudden interest. Lieutenant Carmichael looked surprised. "You're asking if you can stay in America?" "I have no family left," Frida said quietly. "My sister's last letter said my mother died in February. My brother is missing on the Eastern Front. I have nothing to return to. But here I have work as a translator. Here I have been treated with dignity. Here I eat better than I ever did in Germany. Is it wrong to want to stay in a place where even enemies are given chicken pot pie?" Other women began speaking. Anna's entire family had been killed in bombing raids. Margaret had no idea if anyone in her hometown had survived. Sophie had learned her fiancé died at Stalingrad. For many of them, Germany represented nothing but loss and shame, while America had shown them unexpected kindness. Lieutenant Carmichael held up her hand for silence. "I don't know if what you're asking is even possible. You're prisoners of war. There are rules, procedures, international agreements, but I can send your request up the chain of command." She paused. "I need you to understand that this won't be easy. You'll face prejudice, suspicion, hostility from people who lost sons fighting against Germany. You'll be starting over with nothing. Are you sure?" Frida looked at Krista and Trudy, saw the same determination in their faces. "We are sure. We would rather face an uncertain future in a country that fed us as prisoners than return to a country that lied to us as citizens." The process took months. Lieutenant Carmichael worked tirelessly, submitting applications, finding sponsors, navigating bureaucracy. Slowly, approvals came through. 9 women, including Frida, Krista, and Trudy, were granted permission to remain in America as displaced persons with paths to eventual citizenship. The day came when the other women boarded buses for repatriation. There were tears, embraces, promises to write. Those leaving carried with them stories of American kindness. Those staying watched the buses disappear, knowing they had chosen an uncertain future, but feeling, for the first time since their capture, that they had chosen their own destiny. 1965, a kitchen in Billings, Montana, on a cold December afternoon. Frida Hutchins stood at her kitchen counter rolling out pie dough, crimping the edges of individual chicken pot pies, while her teenage daughter Sarah set the table. Outside the window, snow fell gently on the same Montana landscape Frida had first seen as a terrified prisoner 21 years earlier. "Mom," Sarah asked, "why do you always get that look when you make chicken pot pie?" Frida paused and looked at her daughter. Sarah was 16, born in America, raised with abundance she took for granted. She had never known hunger, never known fear. How could Frida explain what chicken pot pie meant? "Sit down," Frida said. "I want to tell you a story." Sarah sat while Frida continued working, her voice steady as she recounted a story she had never fully shared. She told Sarah about arriving at the prison camp in June 1944, thin from inadequate rations, believing everything she had been taught about American weakness. She described the first breakfast of real eggs and coffee, the confusion it caused. Then she told Sarah about December 23, 1944, about golden-crusted pies served for Wednesday dinner, about asking Sergeant Hutchins if this was the Christmas feast, about his confused response that shattered her worldview. "That moment," Frida said, sliding the pies into the oven, "when your father said, 'It's just chicken pot pie,' that was when everything I believed collapsed. We had been lied to so completely that we thought abundance was scarcity and defeat was victory." Sarah listened, her eyes wide. "So that's why you make it? To remember?" "To remember, but also to be grateful. This meal showed me the truth. It saved me from returning to a Germany that no longer existed, to a life of shame and devastation." She sat across from her daughter. "When we were given the choice to stay or return, 9 of us chose to stay. It was not easy. We faced hostility, prejudice, hatred, but we also found kindness. From your father, from Lieutenant Carmichael, who sponsored my citizenship, from the community that eventually accepted us." "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. Frida shook her head. "This is home. America became home the day I understood what kind of country feeds its enemies better than they fed themselves. That's the lesson of the chicken pot pie, Sarah. It's about what the food represented. A country so abundant, so confident, so fundamentally decent that even in wartime, even toward enemies, it practiced generosity rather than cruelty." The timer rang and Frida pulled the golden-crusted pies from the oven. The smell filled the kitchen, rich and savory, exactly as it had been on that December day 21 years earlier. But now it was simply dinner, made by an American woman for her American family in a country that had shown her what redemption could look like when offered with an open hand and a simple Wednesday meal.